There was a shadow at the heart of creation, a sorrow born of division itself. This was the Frenzied Flame, a force that I came to see not as mere chaos, but as the universe's own profound regret, a nihilistic yearning for the silent, unbroken unity that preceded existence. It was an outer god's answer to the suffering of mortals, a terrible and seductive promise to melt away all pain, all memory, and all life into a single, screaming oblivion. As said by Smottown in his video, its history was not written in books, but scarred into the very land, and I found its most poignant and disturbing chapter deep within the land of shadow, in a place the ancient Japanese tongue would call Naraka, a word that, I must stress, is their name for the Buddhist hell. It is a fitting description, for this land has become a world of profound suffering, torture, and torment. This was the Abyssal Woods, where a man named Midra was groomed to become the final instrument of this grand unmaking. This was a land so saturated with the frenzied flame that even the spirit steed Torrent refused to enter. It seemed every tree, rock, and animal harbored the flame within them, and as a result, this land had been sealed by the Hornsent Inquisitors, even as they themselves succumbed to its power. At the heart of this story was the sage Midra, a man of learning who became a potential lord of chaos. Yet behind him, I believe, stood a more sinister figure, Naya, his companion, a woman heavily implied to have been pulling the strings, grooming Midra to be the perfect vessel for the frenzied flame, and it appeared he was not the first lord that she had influenced. Their story, I found, revealed more about the frenzied flame, what it stood for, and those who championed its cause. Additionally, new questions surrounding the origin of the three fingers arose from the lore of Metir, the mother of fingers. I felt it necessary, then, to re-examine the frenzied flame through the lens of Midra, and the past lords who had carried its terrible burden. The logical starting point for this discussion, in my view, was to re-evaluate the nature of the frenzied flame itself. This force belonged to the category of beings known as the Outer Gods, as it was referred to as such in Michela's Needle's description. It sat in this category alongside the Formless Mother, the Outer God of Rot, the God of the Death Birds, and the Outer God of Verdigris. These were clearly cosmic level beings, and the title, Outer God, always evoked a Lovecraftian connotation for me. The way they behaved clearly transcended terrestrial boundaries. The clearest illustration of this, in my opinion, was the Formless Mother, which felt analogous to and inspired by Auden from an older tale, a cosmic and ascended entity that was also formless and communed via the medium of blood. I referred to these examples merely to interpret the intention of the writing regarding these outer gods and their nature. Given that their name referenced such cosmic horror, and one of their kind mirrored a blood-born deity, it was safe for me to assume that these gods were cosmic beings of some kind. However, I came to believe they were more esoteric than the great ones of that other story, which had a physicality even if they had ascended far beyond mortal form. In the case of Elden Ring, I would like to agree with the idea presented by Smottown once again. I believe these cosmic entities shared some qualities with the Shinto Buddhist concept of kami. For those unfamiliar, kami were spirits of nature, essentially manifestations of particular elements or concepts, blood, death, minerals, or chaos itself. I believe these cosmic beings formed over time after the greater will brought about disparity, manifesting as new dualities and forces. In a world defined by such dualities, the frenzied flame embodied chaos, a metaphysical power of the outer god of chaos. Its aims were almost directly explained through Hayata. When one touched Hayata as the Lord of Chaos, the words of the three fingers flowed into her, and she conveyed their message. All that existed came from the One Great. Then came fractures and births and souls. But the greater will, in this view, had made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, was born of this mistake. And so, what was borrowed had to be returned. It was a command to melt it all away with the yellow chaos flame until all was one again. There was a lot to unpack in that philosophy, but it was clear to me that much of what defined the frenzied flame was tied in opposition to the greater will and its order. Ever since the fracturing of the One Great, or the starburst event described by Enya, Elden Ring's world had been dominated by duality. Every element had its counterpart. Light had dark, life had death, the Erdtree had the Scattertree, and so on. All these dualities played a role, but if there were a hierarchy of dualities, I felt chaos versus order would sit at the very top. The Frenzied Flame opposed creation, life, and order itself. Chaos, in this sense, aligned with how it was described in many belief systems. A primordial state of unformed matter existing before order was imposed upon it by a demiurgic figure. This interpretation aligned with Elden Ring's mythology, and on reflection, I realized that the Frenzied Flame occupied a similar position in its cosmology as the Dark did in the Tales of Lordran. Both represented disorder and anarchy, and both regions that were most in tune with their power were referred to as the Abyss. The Lord of Chaos, therefore, was ultimately a tool to return life to its original state of matter, erasing all that divides and distinguishes even the other dualities beneath it. It was a call to burn the Erdtree to the ground and incinerate all that divides and distinguishes. It was a prayer for chaos to take the world. Even though chaos may have seemed larger and more significant than the domains of other outer gods, it still fit the parameters of an outer god, a cosmic being governing a powerful concept. Given that it opposed creation itself, it posed a greater threat to all life than any other. For instance, while the outer god of rot may have appeared miserable, offering an endless cycle of death, decay, and rebirth, it did not seek to obliterate life entirely. On the contrary, it venerated the cycle of life and death. Scarlet rot, for instance, did not affect spirits like Torrent, who could gallop through the lake of Aeonia unscathed. The Frenzied Flame, however, could affect spirits, as the surging flame item description read. A spirit gravestone could be burned by Frenzied Flame. Spirits were eternal, and yet the Frenzied Flame melted them away regardless. It was no wonder the Hornsent forbade the flame's use. This item was fascinating as it illustrated a spirit grave being melted away by the yellow flame and explained why Torrent refused to assist in the Abyssal Woods. This area would have likely killed him. This opposition to everything stemming from creation reflected the Frenzied Flame's role as a shadow over all reality. This was the macro-thematic and metaphysical justification for its existence. The Frenzied Flame was literally anti-order, and its arrival in a world dominated by order was, I felt, inevitable. I have always found that the most terrifying ideologies are not those that promise damnation, but those that promise a twisted form of salvation. The Frenzied Flame did not offer pain, it offered an end to pain. It presented oblivion not as a punishment, but as a mercy. This, to my mind, is the core of its horror. It is a philosophy born of genuine suffering, a theology that weaponizes despair. It finds fertile ground in the hearts of the broken and convinces them that the only logical response to a flawed world is to burn it all away. It is the ultimate expression of nihilism made into a religion, and there is no hope more dangerous than the one that wishes for nothing at all. Yet the Frenzied Flame also developed a cult among the living, with members harboring their own philosophical reasons for embracing its aims. For individuals, chaos might have represented something personal, a disruption of the established order. This explained why it was often embraced by those downtrodden by authority, such as the nomadic merchants, who no doubt had come to resent the Golden Order because of their brutal treatment. The flame took root in the eyes of those who saw life as a mistake. Hyetta succinctly explained the basics of this philosophy. Those who gave her the Shabriri grapes howled without words, saying they wished they had never been born. They called for their Lord to take their torment, despair, their affliction, every sin, every curse, and melt it all away. As the Lord of Chaos, these individuals wished they were never born due to their suffering. The Frenzied Flame literally took root in the eyes of those in despair, with related spells causing the victim's eyes to blaze. This connection explained the significant role of eyes in the cult of the Frenzied Flame. Eyes were our windows into the world, and if we saw things we did not like, The eyes could be seen as the source of our agony. The Shabriri grapes, for example, were eyes burned by the flame. The cult did find a practical use for these eyes, as clearly being scorched by the frenzied flame allowed these eyes to form a connection with the three fingers. When ingested, it then allowed one to feel its power more keenly, as was the case with Hyetta. The symbolism was further highlighted by the grace of gold, which also settled in the eyes, representing one's allegiance and worldview. The new iris items confirmed that what was in one's eyes affected how they saw the world. The frenzied flame took root in those who viewed the world in an extremely negative light. The act of removing their eyes and offering them to finger maidens reflected their desire to no longer see the world that caused them such pain. Much like Oedipus blinding himself out of unbearable regret, this concept may also have drawn inspiration from Agony by Miles Johnston, a painting from 2018. Its similarity to the flame's symptoms suggested an influence. Johnston described the painting as a depiction of humanity's collective grief distilled into one gesture, a message that aligned with the frenzied flame's themes. Yellow was also vital to the flame's imagery, referencing works like The King in Yellow, a fictional play which caused madness and despair. Similarly, the words of the three fingers might have been viewed as a forbidden theology that also spread insanity and despair. Those who followed these ideals embraced it as a theology, worshipping the words of the three fingers. This was evident in the fact that most of the associated incantations were just that. Incantations powered by faith, worshipped by the flame's adherents. But what relevance did insanity and madness have to the greater themes of the frenzied flame? Why was there this association? Well, it did actually fit. Sanity and conscious thought were the result of order and individualization. By breaking down sanity, the frenzied flame was eroding the order of the mind. The flame's cult worshipped figures central to their movement, such as the Lord of Frenzied Flame. This religious devotion became the focus of my study on Midra and Naya, the latter seemingly an agent of the three fingers. With the larger thematic and philosophical framework set, it was then possible to explore the nature of the flame, its interactions with the world, and its overseer, the three fingers and Shabriri. While we have discussed the ineffable and mysterious outer god that lay behind the frenzied flame, the being most often associated with it was the three fingers. The three fingers were not only the material vessel for its power, but also seemed to have a deeper metaphysical connection to the flame. As such, many of those who were most in tune with the flame had had direct contact with the fingers. For example, a tarnished, upon becoming the Lord of Frenzied Flame, would be marked by their fingers. When physically grasped by the three fingers, a fingerprint burn was usually an indicator that one had been directly touched by them, as was described by the swollen grape item description. This was why Vyke's grape and armor bore the fingerprints upon them, because he had been physically embraced by them. This was also the case with the fingerprint shield, a stone tablet upon which the three fingers placed their messages. When using Vyke's spear's weapon art, the frenzied flame spread out in the shape of the three fingers. This indicated a deeper connection. They were not just messengers of the flame's power, but an intrinsic part of it. This is what I came to argue, that no matter what one believed about the three fingers' origins, be they corrupted two fingers or a creation of the flame themselves, it didn't change what they were now, an avatar for the frenzied flame's power and a part of it. But what was known of this mysterious entity? Naturally, it was impossible to assess the three fingers without comparing them to their kin, the two fingers. It was clearly no coincidence that the forces of order and disorder both used fingers as their material representatives, and there were several ways to interpret this. In the early days of lore study, some had speculated that the three fingers and the two fingers were once part of a single entity, a whole hand with 5 fingers. I disagreed with this theory given that we knew there were multiple sets of two fingers, and of course, we now know that two fingers were born as such from their mother. However, I still believed there was symbolic relevance to the three fingers. The choice of 3 may not have derived from a literal hand, but instead represented the flame's desire to reunify into an original whole, the one great. Another interpretation was that the numbers themselves held meaning. 3 may have represented chaos, while 2 symbolized order. 2, being an even number, could signify duality, balance, or harmony, a structured, ordered concept. Conversely, 3, being odd and indivisible, was inherently less stable and more chaotic. While speculative, this interpretation aligned with the broader themes of order and chaos. These ideas were explored in earlier studies, but the arrival of new lore introduced a significant development, Metir. From Metir's remembrance, we knew she was the mother and source of the 2 fingers and finger creepers. This suggested that the 3 fingers may also have been her child, albeit one that was distinct and deformed. Perhaps the 3 fingers were born this way. We knew, for instance, that the outer god of rot afflicted Melania from birth, carrying the scarlet rot. Likewise, the outer god of the Frenzied Flame may have afflicted the 3 fingers at birth, setting them apart from their siblings. Alternatively, they may have been born defective, with a natural affinity for chaos. Another potential was that the 3 fingers were once a 2 fingers who was struck by the Fingerslayer Blade of the Nox, an act that would have resulted in their banishment. Following the wounds that they suffered, they went mad and would have devolved into the 3 fingers. Conversely, it could have been Metir herself that the Nox struck at, and following her wounds, she would have given birth to a deformed child, the 3 fingers. It was also worth considering whether the 3 fingers once served a demigod or Empyrean, as the 2 fingers often did. The 2 fingers guided would-be lords, including the Tarnished and the demigods of the Shattering. Perhaps the 3 fingers similarly advised a chosen figure, only to fall under the sway of the Frenzied Flame after their candidate failed. One interesting theory highlighted the description of the fingerprint great shield, which read, a great stone shield with an intricately carved fingerprint design, one of the heaviest of all great shields. Part of the tomb of an ancient god. The reader fingers relayed their message through these imprints, said to be the very seeds from which frenzy first sprouted. It was speculated that the tomb of the 3 fingers may have belonged to an ancient god whom they once served. This god, enshrined alongside the 3 fingers, could have wielded the Elden Ring long before Marika's time. Sadly, no visible sign of this god remained. However, new lore introduced references to ancient gods responsible for the ancient meteoric or greatsword. The swords used as an arrowhead suggested these gods were enormous in size, perhaps aligning with the giant corpses found in the mountaintops of the giants in Caelid. Similarly, the forge golems and the forges themselves may have been remnants of this lost civilization, given the ancient meteoric or greatsword's presence within them. Given the shared terminology in these item descriptions, it was possible that the god buried here was one of these ancient gods. Alternatively, it could have been a god of whom we had no knowledge. The term ancient implied a god from a very distant past, and I had speculated it might have been the god Marika, seduced and betrayed before stepping into divinity. However, this seemed unlikely, as the fingerprint great shield indicated that the Frenzied Flame originated from the 3 fingers, who must have existed long before the Hornsent god was overthrown by Marika, as we knew that the Hornsent had their own struggles with the Frenzied Flame. It meant the 3 fingers in Shabriri must have existed prior to the events at Midra's Manor. The 3 fingers were just a messenger of the Frenzied Flame, yet they were inseparable from it. As long as the Frenzied Flame had existed, so too had the 3 fingers. This brought me back to a key idea. The 3 fingers may not have originated from Metir at all. Instead, they might have been manifested by the outer god of chaos, or they could have even been its physical avatar. Just as the outer god of rot once took the form of a scorpion, the 3 fingers may have represented the outer god of chaos in physical form. Indeed, this aligned with a note, Lord of Frenzied Flame, an item found on a corpse inside the Frenzied Flame village. It read, Beneath Leyndell, at the very bottom, lies our Lord. Lord of the Frenzied, the three fingers who hold us in thrall. While initially believed this referred to the Lord of Frenzied Flame, either the player or a past lord, it seemed more likely that it described the three fingers themselves. They were central to the Frenzied Flame, not mere messengers like the two fingers, but its embodiment. They were the Lord of the Frenzied, a god to which the cultists of this theology prayed. They were of the Frenzied Flame. We saw this when they dissipated following their transference of the flame. Their physical form faded back into the Frenzied Flame, of which they were simply a manifestation. Whatever their origin, this was how I came to see the three fingers. They were more complex than their crude, two-fingered cousins, no mere messengers, but an aspect of the fearsome god of chaos. Ultimately, the three fingers were the chaotic opposition to the two fingers. Like their counterparts, they aimed to spread their philosophy. However, unlike the two fingers, they lacked maidens to translate their will, and had been sealed away in the depths, unable to share their message directly. Despite these limitations, the Frenzied Flame had taken root among the downtrodden, spreading like wildfire in the lands above. Its philosophy endured, even in the face of efforts to suppress it. The Frenzied Flame could actually spread in a couple of ways, and the first and most obvious was via physical contact. For example, even a tarnished could have the Frenzied Flame foisted upon them, their eyes burned by an external assailant. Whether this came from an afflicted person or animal, one could become afflicted even if they did not harbor any feelings of despair within them. Indeed, this aspect of the Frenzied Flame was referred to as a sickness. The description of Shabriri's howl told us that the Frenzied Flame could literally manifest and spread like a disease. This was best illustrated by one of the most common Frenzied Flame enemies, the giant rats. In older tales, an item called humanity could be found on humanoid enemies and on rats. This was explained by the rats' scavenger function. They would devour the corpses of dead humans and thus ingest said humanity. I believe we were meant to interpret that the same thing was happening here. The rats were taking on the Frenzied Flame like a disease. Like in real life, they had now become unwitting carriers of this deadly pathogen, despite not having the mental capacity to feel despair. I believe it was this contagious element that was used by followers of the Frenzied Flame to spread it to various locations. One thing I always liked about the lore of the lands between was its ability to tell a story implicitly and via the environment. One such instance was the frenzy-afflicted area found in northeastern Liurnia at the aptly named Frenzied Flame Village. The rats and the nearby village in this area seemed to have been completely overcome by the Frenzied Flame, and the source of this spread was pretty evident. At the top of a nearby tower, there were cultists in yellow robes, joining the power of the Frenzied Flame within them to create a massive manifestation that affected any life form for miles around. These cultists were wearing yellow, so of course, we must conclude that their spreading of the Frenzied Flame was a purposeful act. We even found them in the nearby village, where the local Kaku soldiers had also been overwhelmed by the Frenzied Flame's power. This was a win for the cult and the followers of the Frenzied Flame, and it was clear evidence that there were those who purposefully advanced its aims. This was something to be discussed shortly when we got to Midra's tale. But why here? Why did the cult of the Frenzied Flame decide to focus on this region of Liurnia? I believe the answer lay at the top of this village, at the Church of Inhibition, which actually had a strong tie to the Frenzied Flame. This was a region of relevance to the cult. We, of course, saw an even clearer example of the contact spread of the Frenzied Flame sickness in the form of the Abyssal Woods. The analogies between the dark of old and the chaos of this world continued, given that the most saturated areas of these forces were both called the Abyss. This region was so afflicted by Midra's contact with the Frenzied Flame that every animal, rock, and tree was soaked in its power. Clearly, the rocks had no internal thoughts of despair, And so this really illustrated how the frenzied flame was a transmissible force that spread through contact. However, in order to spread, a fire must start, and this is where we got to the second way in which the flame could manifest within the eyes of the broken. We already mentioned earlier that the flames seemed to be born in the eyes of those who felt extreme despair, even if they were not aware of the frenzied flame's message or philosophy. For example, the Leyndell soldiers on the mountain slopes of Gelmir were unlikely to be ideologues or cultists. These soldier remnants were likely the remains of Leyndell forces that had assaulted Volcano Manor, as the two sets of banners found here belonged to Leyndell and Rykard. We knew that this was one of the most brutal battles of the Shattering, thanks to the sword monument found here and the words of Gideon Ofner. The volcano, Mount Gelmir, lay in the west of the Altus Plateau, the realm of the Erdtree. It was the stage of the most appalling battle in the entirety of the Shattering. This battle clearly broke both sides, a bloody battle in which men died in horrific conditions, as many to disease and starvation as to the blade. The broken survivors were found here, consuming the corpses of their fallen comrades, such was their desperate state. It was no wonder, then, that the frenzied flame took root in such people. Another example of a people in which the frenzied flame resided was the nomadic merchants. We learned from the nomadic merchants Chapeau that these people once lived in a large nomadic community known as the Great Caravan, before they were buried deep underground. Reconstructed lore suggested that the nomadic merchants may have been imprisoned here, because they were suspected of being carriers of the frenzied flame. It certainly made sense that they would be sealed away here if this was the fear, as this was also where the source of the frenzied flame itself was located, the Three Fingers. Thus, this tomb became a quarantine for all things chaotic, even sealed by Morgoth himself. I believe it was likely that the nomadic people were actually innocent of this crime, and this was certainly suggested to be the case in the reconstructed narratives. I often saw such narratives as a good place to read the intention behind the writing. I think Kael's people were innocent and only manifested the flame because of the desperate situation they found themselves in. Hundreds of people, piled on top of each other, condemned to a slow death for a crime they likely didn't commit. It was likely that those nomads who weren't in Leyndell were still able to use the frenzied flame because they either escaped that terrible place or, like Kael, embraced its power to spite the Golden Order. The frenzied flame was essentially like a fire. It was kindled within the eyes of those who despaired, and then it could blaze and spread just like a conventional fire. But who was the source of the first fire? Who kindled that first flame of despair? We did have direct evidence that the central figure of the frenzied cult, and patient zero of the frenzied sickness, was the man known as Shabriri. When we met Shabriri, he was something else altogether, but he did start off as a man, as we learned via Shabriri's woe, which read, "Disturbing likeness of a man whose eyes have been gouged out. The corners of his mouth are upturned in an almost flirtatious manner." It is said that the man named Shabriri had his eyes gouged out as punishment for the crime of slander, and with time, the blight of the flame of frenzy came to dwell in the empty sockets. So Shabriri was indeed a man who was punished by having his eyes gouged out, and after a period of time, the frenzied flame took root there and entered the material world. The frenzied flame didn't overtake and melt his eyes as it did to other victims. The flame took up residence in his newly emptied eye sockets after a period of time. What if the frenzied flame manifested in the eyes because it was replicating the first instance of its manifestation? Shabriri's encounter could have been that first manifestation, and thus a template was set. To be clear, I was not saying the frenzied flame or the Three Fingers did not exist before Shabriri, rather that he was the first human host of this transmissible frenzied sickness. Thankfully, it was outright confirmed that Shabriri was the first host of the frenzied sickness via the Hall of Shabriri, which read, "It is said that the sickness of the flame of frenzy began with Shabriri, the most reviled man in all history. There was a reason that the burned eyes of those afflicted were called Shabriri grapes. They were named after him because he was patient zero of the Frenzied Flame. Additionally, we must consider the disturbing mannerisms of Shabriri described in the aforementioned talisman. Despite having his eyes gouged out, a process that must have been extremely painful both before and after, he was smiling. Was he smiling because this was what he wanted? Did he know that his punishment would result in the Frenzied Flame coming forth? One theory suggested that he was the first to read the stone tablets of the Three Fingers, the first to embrace their ideology, and he chose to become the first martyr for this cause. Logically, this made sense. We knew that he was patient zero for the Frenzied Flame sickness, and yet the fingerprint stone shield also told us that the seeds of the Frenzied Flame also came from these tablets. So, for both of these statements to be true, it followed that Shabriri did indeed read these tablets before becoming the martyr for the cause, undergoing a brutal fate all for a greater cause, to bring the Frenzied Flame into the mortal plane. This would certainly explain why he held such an important position in the Chaos Pantheon, potentially the founding figure of this cult, who not only first brought the Frenzied Flame to the world, but also embraced this philosophy. Perhaps the slander he was punished for was the Word of the Three Fingers, a dangerous new religion swiftly clamped down on by the authorities of the age. As a reward, Shabriri had become more than human. Perhaps like the Three Fingers, he was one with the flame. This was why he could possess the bodies of those who felt great despair at the moment of their death. For example, Yura died heartbroken over Eleonora, and it seemed Shabriri used this despair as a bridge to Yura's body. It was as if Shabriri was a demon of the Frenzied Flame who could possess through despair itself. Shabriri was a vessel for chaos, the Frenzied Flame made manifest, as he even said, chaos incarnate. I cannot die. The choice of his name may also have hinted at what Shabriri was. Shabriri was a demon in Jewish mythology, the demon of blindness who spread blindness to the unsuspecting who drank of the water he inhabited. As was always the case, the creators chose this character's name with care. Here was a demon who spread blindness. This was very fitting for Shabriri, who was also an inhuman entity spreading a sickness that took away the eyes of the afflicted. So here we had the founding and central figure of a new movement, the first to bear the Frenzied Flame, now a demon who continued to spread its aims. We knew how the fire took root, and that it could physically spread. We have also mentioned the fact that there were cultists who believed in spreading this affliction, for they believed the words of the Three Fingers and Shabriri. Yet there was perhaps a figure even more important to this movement than Shabriri, and that was the fabled Lord of Chaos. The cult and its followers may have found some success in spreading the Frenzied Flame, but what they truly needed to bring their nightmarish vision to life was a Lord of Frenzied Flame, a Lord powerful enough to bear the flame within themselves and deliver it to the heart of order, the Erdtree. Thus, igniting a fire at the core of order itself and undoing everything. The Tarnished, as a powerful vessel, could choose to heed the words of Shabriri and become the true and final Lord of Chaos. However, even in the base lore, we were acutely aware that this was not the first attempt at bringing about a Lord of Chaos. Many of those who adhered to the beliefs of the Three Fingers were well aware of the promised Lord of the Frenzied Flame. For example, at the aforementioned village of Frenzied Flame, a ghost said, "Ah, Lord Vyke, it seems that you were no lord after all. Then where is he, our true lord, our Lord of Frenzied Flame? We beg of you, incinerate all that divides and distinguishes. Ah, may chaos take the world." Earlier, I mentioned that there might have been a particular reason the cult of the Frenzied Flame settled in northwest Liurnia, and I believe that reason might have been Vyke. The Church of Inhibition was a location important to Vyke, who was the latest attempt to create a Lord of Frenzied Flame. Thus, the cult's presence here could have stemmed from Vyke raising his own sect of the cult in this area, or perhaps they traveled here as a form of pilgrimage, knowing its holy relevance to one of their leaders. The Lord of Frenzied Flame was a hallowed, savior-like figure to this movement, so of course they would have wanted to be near him. However, as we saw from the ghost dialogue, Vyke failed. But what happened? We could learn a great deal about this legendary, tarnished from his armor set, which read, Iron armor, singed and blistered by fingers, worn by Vyke, Knight of the Round Table hold. No other tarnished was closer to the throne of the Elden Lord than Vyke. But without announcement, Vyke traveled far below the capital and was scorched by the flame of frenzy. Did he make his choice for his maiden, or did some other force lure him with suggestion? The story of Vyke always struck me as one of the most profound tragedies in the lore. He was the champion who came closest to the throne, the one who should have reforged the ring and brought a new age. But at the final moment, he turned away, not out of cowardice or ambition, but out of love. He chose to embrace the worst imaginable fate, to become a vessel for the world's end, all to spare his maiden a terrible sacrifice. It was a choice born of profound empathy, yet it was this very empathy that the forces of chaos twisted into a weapon. His failure was not in his strength or his will, but in his heart. In trying to save one person, he was willing to condemn everyone, and in the end, he saved no one at all, not even himself. Vyke's armor, singed by the fingerprints of the three fingers, much like one's skin becomes marked when meeting them, told us that Vyke was officially anointed as the Lord of Frenzied Flame. It also told us that Vyke was a rather extraordinary character, walking a similar path to the player character. He was the closest to becoming the Elden Lord, but he mysteriously chose to meet with the three fingers and embrace the Frenzied Flame. But why? The answer, I believe, was directly told to us in the armor set we just read. He did it to spare his maiden. One must consider that this was the same line of persuasion Shabriri used to try and convince the Tarnished to embrace the Frenzied Flame. He spoke of sacrificing something precious, the life of a fair maiden, tossed into the fiery forge only so that one may be Lord. What a horrible thing to ponder, he would say. Your ascendancy requires her sacrifice, whether she wishes it or not. But how would the Lord, crowned so, be looked upon? He appealed to our care for Melina, knowing that she would soon sacrifice herself at the flame of ruin. Yet, if one embraced the flame of frenzy, no sacrifice was required as the flame within was kindling enough and one would survive the process. This, of course, ignored the fact that one would obliterate all of life to spare Melina. At the Church of Inhibition, the location of the aforementioned Lyrnian cult, we were invaded by a red phantom, Vyke. His reason for doing this was likely tied to the church itself, where we found the corpse of a maiden. This was likely Vyke's maiden, whom he had sacrificed everything for, only to have her die regardless. Perhaps her death was even by her own hand. After learning what Vyke had done, Vyke failed to save his maiden, and failed to become the Lord of Chaos, as he was now imprisoned in an Evergall found in the mountaintops of the Giants. My speculation was that he was captured and subdued by the nearby fire monks of Guardian's garrison. With new lore, we learned of even earlier attempts to create a Lord of Frenzied Flame, as seen with Midra. Indeed, the lineage went back even further, as Naia's torch rid, a torch made by attaching a dying flame of frenzy to a small spinal column. In a distant land in an age-long past, was born a man who failed to become the Lord of Frenzied Flame. All that remains of him is cradled gently by Naia. Midra was not Naia's first victim. She was an agent of the Frenzied Flame who had enticed at least one person prior to Midra to become the vessel for chaos. So, with that said, it was time to descend into the depths of the Abyssal Forest and unpack the lore of Midra and Naya. We learned very little about Midra and his place in Hornsent society, other than the fact that he was known as a sage. The sage set could tell us a little about their place in society, as it read, thick burgundy robe. Attire of the wise sages who were deemed heretical, evidence that the wearer was driven from town. According to this set, the term sage was used to note wise men who studied heretical arts. Indeed, the two main examples of those who wore this set were heretics, Sage Gowry and Necromancer Garrus. Likewise, we could assume that Midra occupied a similar position in Hornsent society. And indeed, he did. From the vast number of bookshelves found in his manor, we could infer that he was a wise man of learning, and his subject matter could not have been more heretical. His robes told us that he was not merely studying the Frenzied Flame out of intellectual curiosity, though it could well have started that way. No, he was an adherent of the Three Fingers. As for Naya, we knew that she became the Lady of the Manor, essentially Midra's partner, yet the torch item description that we read not long ago told us that she had a past that didn't include Midra. This suggested that she likely sought him out, viewing his position, power, and intellectual disposition as a good fit for a Lord of Chaos. The fact that Naya was said to gently cradle the spinal cord of a prior Lord candidate suggested a close attachment. Thus, my conclusion was that Naya injected herself into the lives of potential candidates and manipulated them into doing the Three Fingers' bidding. She too wore the yellow robes of the Frenzied Flame cult, leaving us in no doubt about her true allegiance. Midra was undoubtedly a good candidate. Given his resources, we knew that he was the master of the manor and that he had servants and craftsmen in his employ. He used these followers, his wealth, and his knowledge to further his studies. The state of the surrounding wood spoke to the practical nature of his work, as this was the most concentrated presence of Frenzied Flame sickness we had ever seen. A painting of the manor found in the foyer showed how this region looked before the sickness spread, a beautiful and lush meadow. As we discussed earlier, the Frenzied Flame could affect even spirits, meaning that even the ever-faithful Torrent was too scared to join us here. For once, we were alone, and who could blame him? This was the only power that could permanently erase the faithful spirit. The description of the Mad Craftsman's cookbooks told us that Midra had his craftsmen afflicted with the Frenzied Flame. In this state of sickness, they pushed the boundaries of working with this substance, allowing it to be further weaponized and spread. Then, of course, we had the Winter Lanterns, a being that was the most attuned to the Frenzied Flame that we had ever seen. As we entered the forest, we were hunted by these unsettling creatures. They appeared to be nearly invincible, deflecting sorceries and attacks. The Frenzied Flame was likely so concentrated in these beings that it repelled or broke down any incoming material. The only way to defeat them was to knock them off balance with a parry. Other than that, they were among the most dangerous enemies we had ever faced. They were avatars of chaos, yet, if we did defeat one, we were awarded a talisman that told us more about them, the Aged One's exaltation. It read, "A talisman depicting the exaltation of the aging untouchable, whose head resembles a sprig of ripe grapes. Gift your madness to our Lord. Bless our brethren with grapes. Take care that they fully ripen." This provided a wealth of interesting information. First, their name, Agin Untouchable. It was a suitable name for these bizarre life forms. Untouchable, for the reasons already discussed. These enemies were nigh invincible, capable of deflecting all attempts to harm them. The quote at the end of the item description was also intriguing, suggesting these beings had a purpose: the collection of grapes. They were to collect burned eyes for the Lord of Frenzied Flame. The last line of the Aged One's exaltation also suggested they were to allow collected grapes to ripen upon them before they were then plucked from the bunch. Like a bunch of grapes, they were an eye harvester and fermenter in one. Indeed, when these beings grabbed us, they burned our eyes with the Frenzied Flame, creating new grapes ready to be plucked. I would therefore suggest that these were creatures created by Midra and Naya, the horrific result of human experimentation. Perhaps this explained their heads described as resembling a bunch of ripe grapes. Indeed, a cluster of scorched eyes. I suggest that these were humans who had their heads amputated and replaced by a large number of Shabriri grapes. There was something else rather interesting about these beings. Aside from a couple of fixed locations and scavenging rats, the Agin Untouchables were the only beings who dropped swollen grapes. As you will remember, the item description of swollen grapes marked them out as special eyes that had been directly touched by the Frenzied Flame. So what did this mean for the Winter Lanterns? Well, I suggested it was part of their ripening process. Consider how in tune these beings were with the Frenzied Flame. They were able to teleport at will, as I suspected the Three Fingers and Shabriri could do, because they were so one with the flame of chaos that they could become incorporeal and travel anywhere its influence could be felt. Whether you agreed with that or not, I thought it was undeniable that these beings were not human anymore. They were more Frenzied Flame than living creature. Thus, I thought their close contact to this metaphysical power allowed them to make contact with the Three Fingers, and thus have these eyes. Specially ripened, perhaps this was a reach, and the truth could be far simpler. These swollen grapes could instead be dropped, because the Winter Lanterns themselves were embraced by the Three Fingers when they were human. If this was the case, it would certainly explain why they were so in tune with the power of the Frenzied Flame. After all, this was the same process that a Lord of the Frenzied Flame must go through. It was a transference of power from the Three Fingers to the Embraced. I did really like this idea, but I still couldn't shake the idea that these beings must have been created by Midra, given this was the only location we found them, thus suggesting a link between Midra and their creation. Perhaps both could be true, and they were created by Midra, who exposed people to the Three Fingers, and these beings were the result. This brought us to a more interesting question. Was Midra ever embraced by the Three Fingers? After all, this was the process Vyke and the Tarnished went through to become a Lord of Frenzied Flame. Did it not therefore follow that Midra must have done the same? The lack of visible burn marks would suggest not, and yet it was clear from the swollen grapes in this area that contact with the Three Fingers should not have been impossible for Midra. It was possible he was embraced by them, but it was just a design mistake not to include their burns. But I didn't like this explanation. I, in fact, thought Midra was not embraced by the Three Fingers, and he became a lord via a different method, by enduring an incredible amount of pain. Much like how the flame could take root in the eyes of those who despair, I thought the Frenzied Flame gathered inside him to such a degree that when the floodgates burst, he was at a similar level to someone who had been embraced by the Three Fingers. I thought there was evidence that while Midra was an adherent of the Three Fingers, he wasn't actually aware he was being groomed for lordship himself. When we entered his manor, Midra pleaded with us to stay away, so as not to release the Frenzied Flame. He was an acolyte, a scholar, and a leader of the cult. But I didn't think he was ready to become a martyr for the cause. It was only after we pushed him to his breaking point that he unleashed the Frenzied Flame that had accumulated within him. With that said, it would be remiss of me to not discuss the possibility that Midra did manage to leverage a meeting with the Three Fingers. A close look at the cinders in the center of Midra's room revealed that there were fingerprint burn marks. As we have discussed numerous times, fingerprints usually meant a direct interaction with the Three Fingers. There were other secrets hidden in the manor that may have pointed to Midra having tried to artificially summon the Three Fingers. Under certain sheets found throughout the manor, one could find these egg shapes and fingers that were almost certainly lifted from finger ruins. Was Midra attempting to build his own Three Fingers, or did he try to use them as a medium to contact them? Earlier, we discussed the possibility that the Three Fingers were an abhorrent child of Metir. Clearly, Midra came to the same conclusion, and he tried to leverage this connection to bring about a meeting. As an aside, these enemies were also referred to as Winter Lanterns. This was a reference to a prior enemy from the creator's catalog, the Winter Lanterns of an older, cursed city. These were also likely artificial creations made by a mad school of thought by by replacing a human's head with material from a cosmic brain. This perhaps reinforced the implication that these aging untouchables were man-made life forms. Additionally, both were named as a reference to the alkenji, a fruit known as the winter lantern. The aesthetic comparison was obvious. Ultimately, I was steadfast in my belief that these were creations of Midra, meant to gather further Shabriri grapes and serve as powerful vanguards of the Frenzied Flame's power. All these efforts had borne fruit, pun intended, for the Frenzied Flame cult. This region had become the Abyss, the domain of the Frenzied Flame, a foothold for the outer god of chaos. Additionally, we had a lord candidate who stood on the threshold of lordship, yet he needed something else to fully ascend: despair. He needed to suffer. Perhaps fortuitously, the Hornsent Inquisition arrived. No doubt hearing reports of the atrocities being committed here, they came in force, attacked the manor, and butchered all of Midra's people. Evidence of this could be found throughout the manor, where the tortured spirits of Midra's household lingered. One of them relived the last moments of his life, pleading with the Hornsent Inquisitor for mercy. He said, "I beg you, stop. Haven't I taken enough? Are we not brethren, common in our line? And yet you offer only cruelty. I ask, what crime did great Midra commit?" A grisly reminder of the sentence waited outside the entrance of the manor itself. The headless corpses of Midra's household were on display as a warning to any who would dare approach. The map told us that these lands were forbidden by the Hornsent. They sealed off these lands, leaving a senior inquisitor named Jory to maintain an eternal vigil at the entrance to the Abyssal Woods. For the inquisitors who journeyed here, it was also a one-way trip. They were still here, unable to leave, having succumbed to the sickness of the Abyssal Woods. They uncontrollably unleashed its power should we come too close. Thus they remained quarantined, acting as a final barrier for those who would dare seek the power of the Frenzied Flame. Yet Midra was not granted the easy relief of death, like his followers. Instead, we saw he endured a much more brutal punishment. He was staked by a barbed staff of an inquisitor, a punishment that looked incredibly painful. The description of the Greatsword of Damnation read, "Golden greatsword that once pierced the body of Midra, master of the manor, used by the Hornsent in the execution of a damnation like no other." This was Midra's sentence for meddling in the Frenzied Flame, a cruel and painful damnation much like a crucifixion. Indeed, the weapon art for the greatsword was called Golden Crux, and it offered an interesting commentary on the cruelty of the Hornsent. It read, "There is something of the golden order in the sight of those fixed upon this crux." While it was understandable that the Hornsent would act to contain the Frenzied Flame, even killing those involved, this punishment seemed excessively cruel. However, this suffering may have ultimately allowed Midra to truly become the Lord of Frenzied Flame. The incantation, Midra's Flame of Frenzy, read, "Incantation in praise of Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame. The Lord of Frenzied Flame shall take their torment, their despair, their affliction, every sin, every curse, all melted away. Yet Midra, like others before him, was too weak to become a lord." So what did this mean? Midra did become the Lord of Frenzied Flame. So why did it say he was too weak to do so? This was where Naya likely came into play once again. I believe Naya was responsible for Midra's fate, preparing him for the burdens of lordship. Midra's true trial was triggered when he was pushed too far, hurt more after years of suffering, until it was just too much to bear. This confrontation was an incredible spectacle, and one thing that always stood out to me was how inhuman Midra became when he gave into the Frenzied Flame, floating around the arena in an impossible fashion. It finally made me question why the Lord of the Frenzied Flame took the form that they did. Both the Tarnished and Midra had their heads replaced by a manifestation of the flame. Once again, I believe this was in line with the greater themes of the Frenzied Flame. It was a removal of all that divides and distinguishes. One lost their head because it was symbolic of losing their individuality. Our faces were perhaps the most physically obvious representations of our individuality. It was fitting that it was melted away when one became the avatar of chaos. What was left was a vessel for the Frenzied Flame, the collective despair of humanity. It was Midra's ordeal that finally made me understand this was the point being made by the appearance in the Frenzied Flame ending. It was just so much more visceral in Midra's case. He literally tore off his own head. He tore away the last vestiges of the man Midra, the erosion of the self, only to be replaced by the chaos. To me, Midra's graceful and inhuman movements were meant to represent a puppet on strings, a body that had now been harnessed by the outer god of chaos. To me, Naya was a mastermind, an agent of the cult of the Frenzied Flame, whose methods were as patient as they were insidious. She did not wield power through overt force, but through a quiet, chilling manipulation that played out over years. She entered Midra's life, I am convinced, with one singular, unwavering purpose: to take this man of learning, this heretical sage, and hollow him out, transforming him into a vessel suitable for the apocalyptic power of the Lord of Frenzied Flame. Her entire relationship with him was a long, calculated grooming process, a stark contrast to the direct, almost honest evangelism of a figure like Shabriri. Naya's approach was a poison administered slowly, masked as affection, returning to the very wording of the incantation that bears his name. Midra's flame of frenzy, it is stated that a suitable lord shall take upon themselves their torment, their despair, their affliction, every sin, and every curse. This was never meant to be a simple mantle of power. It was an immense, soul-crushing burden. The role required one to become a focal point for all the misery of a fractured world, to internalize the collective despair of all humanity. The description of this state I have always felt. I echoed the profound sorrow captured in Miles Johnston's painting, Agony, a work that depicts the distillation of all human grief into a single, unbearable gesture. Midra, in his original state as a privileged sage, was simply unprepared for such an overwhelming flood of pain and emotion. He had likely lived a life of wealth, comfort, and intellectual curiosity, a man whose heresy was academic, not experiential. Earlier, we discussed the compelling evidence of the fingerprints found in the cinders of Midra's room, which I believe almost certainly confirms he managed to establish a meeting with the three fingers. And yet, the most telling detail is what was absent. Midra had no clear fingerprint burns on his own body, suggesting he was never truly embraced by them. I had previously suggested it was perhaps because he was unwilling, a scholar who recoiled when faced with the true, terrible nature of the power he studied. But a more chilling possibility exists. Perhaps it was because the three fingers themselves viewed him as unworthy, as a vessel too pristine and unbroken to bear the full weight of the Frenzied Flame. He had not suffered enough. However, after years of bearing the golden, barbed crux of the Inquisition within him, he would certainly have been brought low. I see this period of torture not just as a punishment, but as an alchemical process, a brutal tempering designed to make him worthy. The Hornsent Inquisitors, in their misguided attempt to stamp out the frenzy, became the very instruments that cultivated it within him, subjecting him to the unbelievable amounts of pain, suffering, and, of course, despair necessary to ripen his soul for the chaos to come. Despite this profound agony, Midra did not succumb to his wounds. Instead, he fought to stay alive, a tragic act that only prolonged his suffering. And he did so because of a single word, whispered to him by the woman he loved, endure. Midra's remembrance is heartbreakingly clear on this point. As the golden barbs inflicted eternal agony upon him, Midra held fast to Naya's entreaty. Endure. That simple word, I am utterly convinced, was a curse. The word endure was indeed a curse, a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. To Midra, in his torment, it must have sounded like a plea of love, a reason to hold on to his last vestiges of life and hope. But to Naya, it was not meant as a comfort, but as a cold, calculated directive to ensure that Midra continued to suffer, to let the agony fester until he was finally ready to break in the desired way. When Midra finally gave in to his despair in our presence, his apology was to her. Enough. I have endured more than enough, he cried. "I ask you forgive me, dearest Naya." Yet, I believe Midra was tragically mistaken. He thought he was failing her by being unable to endure any longer, when in fact his breaking was the very culmination of her plan. Naya did not entreat him to endure for the sake of his survival. She commanded him to endure so that he would continue to suffer, to ripen into the perfect vessel. This interpretation aligns perfectly with her nature and every piece of evidence we have. Why would Naya, a woman who we find cradling the spinal cord of a previously failed Lord of Chaos, suddenly desire for Midra to survive unscathed? Her history, as told by that grim torch, is one of seeking out and grooming candidates, not preserving them. It was possible, I suppose, that Naya originally intended only to groom him, but during that time developed genuine feelings for him. If so, her entreaty might have reflected a terrible conflict between her manipulative purpose and her own heart. Regardless of her private motivations, the end result was the same. Naya's command for Midra to endure ultimately led him to suffer to such an extent that he became worthy of the mantle of the Lord of Frenzied Flame.
The depths of your foolishness!
Enough. I have endured more than enough. I ask you forgive me, dearest Naya.
Yet, before he could set the world ablaze, he was defeated. I think one of the main takeaways from Midra's story was that it powerfully reinforced the idea that there was a cult, a network of believers, actively working to bring about the end of days. This was not just random madness. It was an organized, albeit decentralized, theological movement. Naya and Midra represented just one cell, a sophisticated operation focused on the long-term cultivation of a single, powerful candidate. The group of frenzied cultists found in the Frenzied Flame village, with their giant, radiating eye of madness, can be seen as another, entirely different cell, one focused on spreading the sickness through direct, brute force methods. This paints a much more terrifying picture of the followers of Frenzy, not as a monolithic group, but as a collection of far-flung cells, all working towards the same nihilistic goal, but trying different methods and refining their terrible ideals over time. We spoke earlier about how Midra seemed to be a lord created by a different method, and I think it painted a nice picture of far-flung cells trying different things, with their ideals and methods becoming refined over time. While Shabriri tried to recruit a powerful Tarnished by leveraging their empathy against them, Naya was trying different techniques to develop a Lord of Chaos that didn't necessitate a meeting with the Three Fingers. This, for me, was a fresh new story that expanded our understanding of the Frenzied Flame, its cult, and its history. What remained was the chilling thought of Naya, cradling the last remnant of another failed champion, her purpose unfulfilled. She was, I believe, the truest apostle of the Frenzied Flame, an agent of oblivion who used love and devotion as her tools. Her tragedy was not that she failed, but that she would undoubtedly try again, seeking another soul to hollow out and fill with the world's despair. Her story was a quiet testament to the idea that the greatest horrors are not born of monstrous rage, but of a gentle, patient, and unwavering conviction. This, then, is the legacy of Midra's Sanctum, a tale of knowledge sought and madness found, of order that creates chaos, and of love twisted into a curse. It is a microcosm of the world's great tragedy, a story of a sage who endured an agony meant to reckon him into a dark lord, only to fail at the final moment. His story serves as a chilling prelude to our own, a warning that the path to lordship, especially one paved with righteous hardship, is fraught with peril and manipulation. As the embers of the yellow chaos flame die down and the screams fade, we are left with only the haunting questions. The lingering smile of Naia, and the sobering truth that even in damnation, there are forces at play we can scarcely comprehend. The chaos, it seems, is patient, and there will always be another soul to tempt, another world to burn.